coming out tonight. We're glad to see a lot of new and old faces. We're happy that everybody has come out to this event. My name is Noel Bynum. I'm the International Education Program Coordinator with the Center for European Studies. And I want to introduce really quickly Dr. Christiane Lemke. Dr. Lemke is a visiting professor here at UNC, but she has a primary appointment, with the Political Science Department at the University of Hannover. And she has been a visiting scholar for a number of years here at UNC and also holds appointments at Stanford, Harvard, Suffolk, and a few other universities right now. We're very happy to have her as a permanent visiting scholar, essentially. She's come almost every year, I think, since the inception of the TAM program. And the evening lecture tonight is entitled The Populist Challenge, A European Perspective. So with that, I want to turn it over to Dr. Lemke, and thank you very much for coming today.
Thank you. Thank you, Noel, for the kind introduction. It is indeed, the case that I come here almost every fall now, since 2004, because I think this is one of the best European studies programs in the country. And as someone who's interested in supporting and promoting transatlantic relations, I think this is a great place to be. The topic tonight is not as pleasant as the weather outside. It's one of the most disturbing developments in Europe on the continent, that populist parties have gained political influence in the past couple of years, and we're trying to kind of understand, are they here to stay? What kind of drives these populist parties and movements, and what are the consequences? As you all know, in 2019 in May, there will be European parliamentary elections, and a lot of the predictions are pretty bleak, saying that the populist parties may actually gain, may turn the elections into a referendum, so to speak, on do we even want the EU or not. So the whole project of European integration is most likely going to be challenged seriously. And this is why I say the populist challenge, a European perspective. Even though I worked a lot on the United States, I will mainly speak about Europe tonight. I may draw some kind of parallels, or sometimes, allude to the US development, but we can probably, in the discussion, we will kind of look more closely into some comparative aspects as well. So first of all, one of the questions that we always address in the beginning is the definition, what is populism to begin with? And I would like to use Jan Werner Müller's definition that at the core of populism is the distinction between the people and the elite. And the elite could be the government, it could be us at the university, it could be the journalists, writing. So it's not always clear, what the elite is, but kind of this rhetoric of we are the people, this is kind of the remote, detached establishment is very typical. But what Jan Werner Müller also points out is that there is a kind of a triangle. It's not only us against them, but there's also an outgroup. This distinction between the insider and the outsider, the migrant, the indigenous population. So, as you go across Europe, you will find anti-immigration positions, you will find some racist positions, and so on. So this is kind of important to keep in mind. Now, one of the interesting features right now is that populism is a transatlantic phenomenon. It's not only, American, it's not only European, but it's more transatlantic. And some observers kind of think it's all the same, it's a reaction to globalization. And that's it. But I argue that there are distinct differences actually between Europe and the United States, which is why I want to focus on Europe tonight and kind of flesh that out a little bit. And right. So in the literature, you find very different definitions of what is the challenge. I mean, what exactly is the challenge to political science, but also to our societies regarding populism. And one set of literature talks about the systemic kind of challenge, meaning that the European democracies are doomed to fail at some point. Populists are becoming so strong, look at Poland or Hungary, that they will kind of unsettle the democratic system as such. Yasha Monk is one of the authors writing about this. He's very skeptical with the future of democracy as such. And in the US, this literature, talking about the United States, talks about fascism and sees Trumpism as kind of the beginning of the authoritarian, potentially fascist movement. But here, in terms of Europe, we have historical examples where European countries kind of started with populist movements, and then, you know, dictatorship like fascism or National Socialism followed, and Monk sees something very similar. The structural difference, actually it's right up here, the structural kind of challenge, and that's another set of literature, argues that there are certain features that are being challenged, like the freedom of press, or the independence of the judiciary. Grzegorz Ikert, who's writing on East Central Europe, argues that these populist parties, once they are in government or part of government, will kind of unsettle the checks and balances system in certain parts of the democratic setup. And then there are others arguing that, you know, it's basically a cultural problem. Roger Brubaker, Pippa Norris, and Ronald Inglehart saying that, well, you know, what populism really is about is identity. And what we see is kind of this anti-foreigner, kind of anti-immigration, identitarian movement, identity issue, right? And that's kind of the major challenge that societies are closing and blocking out others. Okay, so I will kind of, in my talk, talk about the different challenges using case studies, examples, and I will do that in a minute. Let me first of all remind you that, all right, that there are historical, legacies in Europe, and that makes the problem of populism very pressing. It's not a movement for renewal, even though political science sometimes writes about, you know, the long and contentious history of populism in different countries, especially in the US, saying that, in fact, in the 19th century, populists were very important in American politics, and they played a kind of the role of pushing for renewal, right? So maybe this could happen in Europe as well. So some of the literature says populism is a threat or isn't a threat. Others say, like Ernesto Laclau, neo-Marxist author, well, populism has a good thing because it's a grassroots movement, so maybe we are seeing some renewal and political parties are not always right, so maybe we should not be too worried about populism. Now, he wrote some time back. He did not write about current events. Seymour Martin Lipset and others have argued that populism has something very irrational. Voters are not deciding on the basis of, you know, rational choices. Is this good for me? You know, how does it change my social or economic position? But it's irrational. It builds on fear. It builds on kind of emotions, and people kind of feel drawn into this field of populism because they are emotionally disturbed or uncertain about the future and so on. Like I say, the historical legacies in Europe are pretty kind of troubling when you go back into the 19th and especially the 20th century. We have several movements that start as kind of bottom-up movements outside of representative democracy, challenging the establishment, challenging parties and elections. Italian fascism, National Socialism started out, as a movement, but then kind of took over the political system, changed it to dictatorship, and obviously to one of the most brutal, oppressive, and destructive forces in Europe. So whenever we see populist movements, we are kind of alarmed, saying, well, we don't want to see history returning. But there's also, in political theory, there are some theorists in Europe arguing that maybe representative democracy and pluralism are not the best form to organize societies. Maybe, we should have more of a center kind of authoritarianism would be an example, that in difficult times you need a strong leader, right? And maybe, pluralist democracy will create chaos because you have several parties, and Carl Schmitt, for example, in Germany, and others have argued that the form of parliamentary democracy is not the best form to organize society. So there are also kind of intellectual influences on what we see. Steve Bannon, who was a close advisor to President Trump, he draws on these experiences of European movements, populist movements on the right, and he kind of sees them as a positive, kind of a good example that one should follow, kind of renewing society. What I would argue here is that the contemporary rise of populism, the rise of populism we've seen in the past, I would say 5 to 8 years in Europe, is linked to a much broader and deeper process. It's not only kind of drawing on history that we see the old Nazis coming back or the old racists coming back, but it is very closely linked to globalization and the way society react and respond to increased trade, increased connectiveness. The globalization, as you know, has winners and losers. It's not a kind of uncontroversial, I should say, development. A lot of ways we conduct or we kind of organize our economies and societies have changed. And populism is a particular response to these processes of transnationalism and globalization. There's actually some literature being very kind of proposing some very interesting thoughts about the political economy of globalization and how this plays out in populism. For example, populists typically want to close the borders, right? I mean, the increased transnational migration, which is particularly strong in Europe, because since the Maastricht Treaty, we have the open borders, the 4 freedoms, people move freely between the countries, and during the Brexit decision and the kind of discussions leading up to the Brexit referendum, part of the populist discourse was directed against Polish workers or people from Bulgaria coming, which is kind of now the norm in Europe, that workers kind of move around. Populists do not only want to block the migration from Africa or the refugees, but also stop this kind of inner European mobility, right? Some populists would like to also restrict the transfer of capital and goods. And the US is an outlier because President Trump would like to do both, block migration and block trade, right? With the tariffs, he doesn't want the goods from Europe and Asian countries and so on. In Europe, populists typically support free trade. And it's very interesting that even in the countries like Poland and Hungary, where we have very strong populist movements kind of arguing to close the borders, right? Blocking an inner European kind of distribution of refugees, for example. They love free trade. And they want to keep this kind of openness in terms of investment, in terms of trade. So that's kind of an interesting difference here between Europe and the US. What we also see in Europe, and that is a very interesting kind of theoretically and politically very interesting development, populism is usually associated with right-wing populism, but we also see left-wing populism. And I will talk about this in a minute, meaning that you have some populist movements that kind of draw on the more inclusion-exclusion model on the right, and some left-wing populism kind of addressing economic issues, distribution, criticizing, capitalism as such, or criticizing the influence of particular economic institutions. Kind of the underlying social processes are very interesting, and there are a couple of books out showing that the decline of social mobility, kind of this expectation, my children will live better than I do. The experience of, you start out with hard work and then you kind of move up, you have a house, you have a car, and so on. That this kind of upward mobility is blocked in many countries, including the United States, and many European countries. And even though we are very wealthy countries in Europe in general, compared on a global scale, right? Europe is a very wealthy continent. People feel like there's a stagnation. And there are certain groups like elderly people or single mothers or workers in East Germany, for example, who have difficulties finding a job, who feel like society is not really giving back. They are not seeing any light at the end of the tunnel, no upward mobility. And there is some talk about strangers in their own land. This is an American book by Arlie Hochschild. Others talk about broken promises, you don't see this upward mobility. And it's not so much about, how shall I put it, the economic hard facts that you look at people's income, but it's what people think is happening, right? What I find very interesting, for example, in the German case, that the right-wing AfD, the Alliance for Germany, a lot of people who are voting for the party, who are organizing rallies, are not your unemployed or your marginalized groups. These are people who have jobs, income, and still, they feel like something is going wrong for them. They don't get what they think they deserve, and feel like, they should protest against this establishment. There are many, many causes why that's the case, and we can probably address that in the discussion a little more. First, I would like to introduce a typology, so to speak. Like I said, populism occurs in the United States, but also in Europe, of course, and since the Brexit referendum 2016, we see an even greater influence of this kind of populist thought. Rogers Brubaker suggests that we should distinguish three types in Europe. I would like to pick this up for my presentation about the different country studies, but I would like to modify it a little bit. Rogers Brubaker, and I have a list of literature in the end. If you want to read up, I have a bibliography.
We'll also upload the PowerPoint presentation and the lecture as well, so if you want to revisit it to find through, we'll put it up.
Okay, yeah, because there's a lot on all of the slides, I realize that. Brubaker suggests, again, that there are differences between the US and Europe, and he says the populism of the Trump supporters is more along the lines of economic nationalism, and this closing off of the border, in particularly through protectionism, introducing tariffs, and so on, kind of closing off the American industry so that it could, become strong again, according to Donald Trump. The core is, economics. It's all about kind of economic America first nationalism. And he then writes about what he calls civilization, populism, which focuses on the clash, so-called clash of civilizations between the Christian world and the Islamic world. And the anti-kind of Islam rhetoric, which is very strong in, I would say, all European countries, and some more than others. The Netherlands is a good example of, focusing on the question of Islam almost exclusively. So it's more about identity, us against the outsider, and the outsider, that's the Muslim population. You see that also in Germany. I'll say more about that. What is civilizational about it? Well, the argument is not only against, the Muslim religion. The argument is against kind of the social practices of groups that came to settle in the country. And according to the right-wing populists, they do not observe, for example, the rights of women. Very interesting. That the right-wing populists would say we don't like Islam because it's a misogynist, hostile to women's rights religion, and we defend, the European values of civilization against the Muslim intruders. Okay, very problematic. And then you have East Central Europe. And that's a very interesting region. Rogers Brubaker has written a lot about East Central Europe, and also minorities, migration in East Central Europe. And he calls, or he groups these countries together, like Poland and Hungary, the Czech Republic, as populist, nationalist countries. That, the nation identification with, a particular form of extreme nationalism, that's important to them. We also find in the literature kind of this term authoritarian nationalism. That's a term Pippa Norris uses, that, part of it is also that you have a strong leader and, an authoritarian structure where you don't need public opinion, you don't need independent judges, it's kind of Viktor Orban deciding everything in Hungary. And what is also interesting about these countries is the anti-EU rhetoric, that they do not want to withdraw from the European Union, like the British United Kingdom Independence Party. They're very, very, very critical with the EU, saying, they are dominating us, they're intruding into our ways of, life and culture and political decisions. We don't like that. So they are against deeper integration of the European Union, but they still want to be member of the club. What I would suggest is that we also look at the distinction, like I said earlier, in Europe between left and right-wing populism. Some authors, Philip Mano, a colleague from the University of Bremen, suggests, that is a major distinction, that you have leftist populism in Southern Europe and right-wing populism in Northern Europe, right? So you have this north-south distinction, and he says, well, East Central Europe is a completely different case, and he doesn't go into this, but he links these different forms of populism to the type of welfare state. Makes a very, I think, convincing argument how countries with a strong welfare state in Northern Europe see the rise of populism as what he calls welfare chauvinism. You want to defend your social rights against, you know, the newcomers. You don't want to share it. You want it for yourself, right? Whereas in Southern Europe, the welfare state is structured very differently. Certain groups benefit, others don't as much. There is a large informal sector, a different political economy. So the migrants coming in, you know, they work in the informal sector. They are kind of not really competing for welfare rights or social benefits, like in Greece in particular, but also in Italy. So that's not really the kind of dividing line in the South, but it's more about, you know, economic distribution in general. So that should be a dividing line. Yeah, so we have these different types, and I would like, in a minute, I would like to introduce some cases here to you. But first, let me show you one key problem, I think, why, as political scientists, we're so concerned about populism, and it has to do with the trust in institutions. This is here from the Pew Research Center. This is a chart from the US showing that trust in federal government is at a historic low, right? It goes down from 1958. In the 50s, you have 73, 77% of the people responding, yes, we trust federal government, and it goes down, down, down. A little spike up here during the Bush years, during the 9/11 crisis, and then, you know, it goes down 20%. I mean, this is really kind of a key problem. You know, if people do not trust in the established institutions of government, if people do not trust political parties to represent their interests, I mean, you really have a problem in our model of democracy where, you know, we actually, it's built on trust, it's built on kind of delegating power to institutions. Some authors have argued that, like Yashamon, for example, the same is true in Europe. There is a rapid decline of trust. The institutions are failing. They are not respected anymore, you know, be it government, parties, the judiciary. I think this perspective is over-exaggerated. The data does not really support this kind of very pessimistic view. People still in Europe trust their governments, but you see it's kind of like a cycle, and with the Eurozone crisis, trust in the government went down, and whenever you have a crisis, of course, you know, you see that reflected in the data, but we are not at a point where I would be deeply concerned, you know, that people are no longer following the rules of democracy. On the contrary, it's quite interesting. I was just looking at a German study how a survey where people were asked a couple of questions in Germany, like, do you think that Muslims and non-Muslims can live peacefully together in a community, right? And the vast majority of people responded yes. 82% said yes. We think that Muslims and non-Muslims can live together peacefully, right? So with all the kind of concern about the populist challenge, it is still a minority group, right? Most people enjoy the open society, want to support it, especially in the younger generation. And like I say, most people see the presence of migrants as beneficial. Okay, just wanted to put that out, that you don't think, you know, with all the rise in populist parties that we are no longer living in multicultural societies. No, there are a lot of problems. Yeah, The other kind of chart I briefly wanted to show here, and of course this needs a little more interpretation. I don't want to go into this, but in detail. But what it shows, 1991 to 2010, the decline of the middle class in several countries, including and most pronounced in the United States. And this decline of the middle class in economic terms. A lot of authors talk about how this influenced the rise of the vote for Donald Trump. That indeed the middle class is declining. Now 59% belonging to the middle class in the US is very comparatively very low compared to other European countries. You see other European countries on the left, like Germany, Finland, Norway, Denmark, also with a declining middle class, right? These are also countries with a strong populist kind of surge. But then there are others who don't quite fit the picture, the Netherlands, or for example the UK and France, where the middle class obviously is expanding, but we also have populist movements. So it's a bit more complicated than just linking it to the socioeconomic situation. But what is interesting is, the very low kind of, or the decline in the US as compared to Europe. I'd now like to talk about some of the examples. And, this of course opens the door for a whole research agenda. And when we were working on our book on Germany Today, Helga Welch and myself, and we looked at the German data, it was kind of an outlier case because there was no strong right-wing party in Germany until the elections last year, right? But everywhere else in Europe, this has been, an issue for quite some time. I would like to start with left-wing populism, and we see most clearly that the rise of left-wing populism is linked to the Eurozone crisis. And the Eurozone crisis, as a result of the global financial crisis in 2009, 10, 11, hit Southern Europe particularly hard. And two countries, I chose Greece and Spain. We can also talk about Italy, which would fit nicely into this group here. And the cases of Greece and Spain are very, very interesting. Syriza in Greece and in Spain, Podemos. Syriza they are in government, right? The prime minister is Alexis Tsipras, is in government currently. It's a party that was founded in 2004 as kind of an electoral alliance, very broad alliance. It was called the Big Tent of the Left. All kinds of different groups, from Marxists, Trotskyists, neo-Marxists, to green groups. The idea was 2004 to go together as a coalition. At first, this kind of left movement did not enjoy great success, but it was quite clear that by the time the Euro crisis arrived, 2010 and 11, Syriza gained more and more votes. So it's the largest party in Greece today. Its ideology is clearly anti-establishment. They argue that the two major parties, the PASOK, the Socialists, and the Center Party, they had failed, and you needed a new renewal, basically. Now, why is it a left populist party? Because it is very clearly against the austerity policy prescribed during the Eurozone to kind of cope with the large state debt in Greece. And this austerity policy was introduced by the other Eurozone countries, pushed by Germany. And the Troika here, that's kind of the buzzword, that's the enemy, so to speak. When we talk about us against them, it's Greece against the Troika, and that's the IMF, the Eurozone and the ECB. So you're against their policies of austerity. They are clearly against neoliberal economics, very clearly. Some social democratic ideas, soft Euroscepticism is also in the package. Like I say, most of these populist parties in Europe, and UKIP, I guess, in Britain is the exception, are critical with the EU, but they don't want to leave the European Union. Syriza, even though the crisis was so kind of severe in Greece, and there was so much, grievance and criticism, and Greece really went through a very, very hard time in the past couple of years, and still is economically in a very precarious situation. But leaving the Eurozone or leaving the European Union, was not an option. Yeah, to be sure, Greece also has a right-wing, an ultra-nationalist group. It's not only left-wing populism, but also right-wing populism. But here we have a clear case of a very influential movement. In Spain, we have also a very interesting development. Podemos actually, in the last national elections, 2015, received 21%, and it's the second largest party, if I remember correctly. It has kind of roots in grassroots groups, I should say. It was founded as a political party only in 2014, but before that, it was a movement. It was a kind of left populist movement, bottom up, called the M15, fighting against corruption in Spain, fighting against poverty, fighting against unemployment. During the Eurozone crisis, 50% of the young people became unemployed. In some regions it was, a little better than in others, but the Indignados movement, people who were upset, people who were upset about this kind of social situation, spread all over. And I remember when we had the European Studies Conference in Barcelona, people were camping out in the main square, just like Occupy Wall Street in New York. People who were protesting against capitalism as such and protesting against neoliberal economics. And these were young people, these were kind of intellectuals, students, organized groups, fighting, like I said, against unemployment. But then, it formed a political party in 2014. So it is a party. It's not a kind of movement anymore because it has to do with the electoral system. The whole movement, the M15, Indignados movement, and others were part of the Spanish financial crisis, the Eurozone crisis, 2008, 9, 10. So again, you have this economic kind of connection here. Yeah, from their program, fighting poverty, fighting the austerity policy of the European Central Bank and the EU, and corruption and so on. This is a true grassroots movement, and a very, very interesting kind of case. I could go to Italy as well with a 5-star movement. Another kind of more left-leaning, it's kind of a diverse coalition, but it started as a left-leaning group and entered government. Let me now turn to right-wing populism, because the picture is quite different. And I have 4 cases. I follow the typology I introduced earlier by Roger Brubaker, to show you, how different these cases are, right? And it's very important, when you do research, to look at the variety of cases, and then, we group them, of course. But I have 4 cases: the Netherlands, Hungary, Germany, and Italy. Okay. So the Party for Freedom in the Netherlands is one of the older, so to speak, right-wing populist parties. Geert Wilders, you've heard about him, I'm sure. The party increased the share of the vote. They increased so that in 2017, just last year, they received 13% of the vote. This was shortly before the German elections. And there was a lot of concern and before the Italian elections, a lot of concern, if they are so strong, becoming stronger in the Netherlands, certainly in other European countries, we will also see a surge of right-wing populism. They were actually founded in 2006, so quite some time ago, centering around the migration issue and immigration to the Netherlands. Populism is not always, a grassroots, or most of the time it is not a grassroots movement. The Netherlands is a good case in point. The leader is a very authoritarian person. There are no party congresses. There is no kind of collective decision making or something. He is the party, so to speak. And what stands out is the anti-Islam program. There is high immigration to the Netherlands over the past 20 years, I would say, from different parts of the world and also within the European Union. And this kind of notion, we, the true Dutch people, we don't want Muslims anymore, ban minarets, ban the mosques, and so on. Very strong Euroscepticism to the point where the PVV would like to withdraw from the EU. It's not quite clear. It's kind of changing. But the last statements I've heard were more Eurosceptic than in earlier times. What some authors say is half liberal nationalists. It's kind of a strange word, which is why I put it in parentheses. Is there half liberal? No, you're either liberal, open-minded, or you're not. But it means that they have some interesting positions on, for example, same-sex marriage. They think it's okay, and they want to defend this against Islam, which they think is intolerant, and the same with women's rights. And it's kind of, like I say, a civilizational issue. The same is true with the Alliance for Germany in Germany. One of their leaders is a lesbian businesswoman, and the AfD tries to kind of position itself as we are defending women's rights. And we don't like the headscarf. We don't like Muslims. Period. If you really look closely at the gender issue, it's not really about gender rights. It's more about anti-Islam. Opposing Islam as part of the society, and they use these kind of pieces to the puzzle, saying, we address, the gender issue. There is a term the AfD, Alice Weidel, likes to use. It's called gender madness, right? So the EU has a gender mainstreaming policy promoting, the equal rights of women and promoting women in leadership, and she says, all this is gender madness, forget about it. Strongly opposed to gender mainstreaming, which they see as the evil of all times. So I think one of the interesting features with these populist parties is you really have to look behind the scene. They say something, but why do they say it? What do they mean by this kind of rhetoric? And like I say, it's Islamophobic in the first place. Now, Hungary is a very interesting case, and later on in the semester we will have a colleague from Hungary here talking about the Hungarian situation. It is, I find it very disturbing because the Fidesz party started out in the late 80s as a party opposing communism, a democratic movement, and it was a movement for renewal. Hungary was seen as the forerunner in democratic renewal in East Central Europe. And as you know, I've done a lot of research on the transition countries of East Central Europe, and Hungary was the case where we thought democracy will be established fairly quickly, and it will be a model country, a very, vibrant democracy. And then Poland also, will have a democracy. What we see now is a backlash in exactly these two countries, Poland and Hungary, right? And that is interesting in itself. Viktor Orban is the prime minister and governs the country now for a longer period of time. So you have a democratic renewal after 1990, after the founding elections, the first free elections, but then a transition or a backlash to an authoritarian approach. Fidesz has become very Eurosceptic, one of the strongest Eurosceptic parties, very nationalistic, and when you look at the kind of rhetoric and the program, Fidesz goes back to the greatness of the Hungarian Empire and draws on national myths and claims to speak for all Hungarians. If you study European history, Hungary was kind of reduced to a smaller size, so there are substantial minorities after the First World War in other European countries, including Romania and Slovakia, and some in Austria, and he claims to speak for all Hungarians, even those abroad, right? Which is, not okay. It's also strictly anti-immigration. The statement from Orban is, we do not want any Muslims in our country. Another statement, we do not accept refugees through the distribution, which is actually a legal decision in the EU, that after the refugee crisis, that refugees would be distributed. It's also, some of the rhetoric is anti-Semitic, some of the rhetoric is anti-Gypsy. There is a substantial Roma minority in Hungary, and Orban is strictly against any programs of integration. Again, Hungary is an interesting case because Fidesz is not the only party on the right. You have Jobbik, which is another party on the right, an extremist party with some, neo-Nazi ideologies and some racist ideologies. So I hope that our colleague from Budapest has some, explanations why Hungary is such a difficult case, even though the economy is doing well, right? Even though, Hungary is not a poor country anymore. And particularly in the urban areas, the country has benefited a lot from open trade, from open borders, for goods and capital, and that's why they are so interested in staying in the European Union. Germany, again, is a case for the rise of a right-wing populist party, which is anti-Islam mostly, made a very interesting transition from being anti-Euro when it was founded a couple of years ago. It was first founded as a political party opposing the Euro, right? But with the refugee crisis, the party shifted towards strict anti-immigration. When you look at their speeches in the federal parliament, it is all about immigrants, whether it's security or education, or they always link it to, the increase of immigrants. in the last federal elections, and that came as kind of a surprise. They got 12.6% of the vote, the third strongest party. According to recent surveys, they are even gaining. If there would be federal elections on Sunday, they would get, they would come in as the second strongest party, 16%. So, you know, the electoral support is increasing, and they are also represented in, they're not only in the federal parliament, they are also in all but 2 state parliaments by now. Yeah, like I say, they were founded originally by university professors in finance and economics opposing the euro. And they transformed to a right-wing populist party. Actually, what I find very disturbing is that the AfD moved even further to the right. The longer they've been around, the more support they get, the more they have radicalized, and they are more to the right. Some of the representatives in federal parliament are extremists, neo-Nazis, and there is a proposal by Social Democrats to put them under surveillance by the German state. We have very strict laws against neo-Nazi propaganda and ideology, and against extremism on the right and on the left. And so the proposal was to put them under surveillance and see if they are anti-constitutional and maybe, I don't know, could be outlawed or some punishment, like not receiving funds for their party. Anti-Islam, very clearly, and anti-immigration. Now the Lega Nord, I will just very briefly go over the Lega Nord because it is interesting, again, because the party made a transition from a regional party demanding independence for northern Italy, that's how they started, to a party that is now called the Lega, not Lega Nord, but Lega, a political party for all of Italy. And in the last elections in March this year, they received 17%, the third strongest party in Italy, not only regional, and they are in government with Matteo Salvini, who is the Interior Minister of Italy right now. It is the oldest right-wing populist party, founded in the 80s. Clearly on a separatist platform, and because they argued that the wealthy north is paying for the poorer south in Italy. This was not right. They wanted to be independent, and Padania is kind of a construct that has never existed historically. It's different from Catalonia and, you know, Spain. Padania has never existed, but they argue, you know, we create the state in the north and want to become independent. Now, you know, the transformation of this party, it is strictly anti-immigration. There are some xenophobic elements, some very clearly Eurosceptic elements. What I find interesting is that this party does not simply say, let's close the borders, even though that's also part of their agenda, not to let any of the ships that are in the Mediterranean with refugees from Northern Africa land in Italian harbors anymore. Matteo Salvini, as the Minister of Interior, has jurisdiction over, you know, these decisions. He said no more ships in Italian harbors, right? But they also promote the distribution of refugees. It's in their own interest to say, we already have so many refugees, let's find the European solution, right? To send them elsewhere and to find a European way to house the large number of refugees. Again, it is a right-wing kind of ideology. Anti-liberalism is the key to all of these right-wing parties. They see liberalism as a root cause for the crisis of democracy, not the other way around. I would say it's the other way around. You know, you have a crisis of democracy if liberalism is questioned, but they say, well, we have too much of it. So there are some very interesting ideological battles over democracy as well. This is my last slide. It's a bit full. You know, I hope you can bear with me because I'm trying to summarize, but also kind of to show some prospects here. Left-wing, I start with left-wing populism. It is clearly a reaction to the Eurozone crisis. And the Eurozone crisis played out very differently in different countries, hit the Southern European countries economically, socially most, and you have the strongest reaction in the countries hit hardest, namely Greece, Spain, but also Italy and Portugal. I would say, you know, you often find in the literature populism is all about identity. I don't think that is true. I would argue that populism is also about economics and distribution. Left-wing populists are addressing the inequality, the unemployment problems. So it is, there's also this kind of distributive cleavage here. Here, this is the left-wing populism argument. Often they have simple answers to complex, questions. And I think that's one of the general characteristics of populism, that you come up with simple answers, sounds convincing, great, but you don't really lay out how you are then going to do this, what you have in your program. We saw that with Syriza in Greece. It's easy to say the Troika is wrong, Germany is a terrible country, and to paint Angela Merkel as a Nazi, but then what are you going to do? How are you going to overcome the economic crisis in Greece? There are some proposals, but populists are not really the people to think this through thoroughly. Right-wing populism has roots in European anti-democratic and illiberal thought and practice. There are long historical roots here, and very kind of troubling memories we have about fascism and National Socialism and Frankism in Spain. But what we see is that right-wing populism is clearly fueled by increased migration and particularly by the refugee crisis, which is why I think it's here to stay. There were some political scientists saying, well, once they are in parliament, once they are part of government, we will see that they don't know how to do things, and they will just disintegrate. And we do have examples, especially in Germany, where right-wing parties entered parliament, the Republicans, for example, the Schild-Partei, where they entered, parliament, and then they would fight among themselves. They would never go to meetings. They would just be totally inefficient, right? But in the current situation, I would say be careful. I don't think this is going to happen with AfD or with some of the other populist parties, because the issues are not going away. We will have refugees coming for years to come. Responses are kind of difficult and complex. We do have multicultural societies in all European countries. A lot of issues that we address are not simply going away. In right-wing populism, I would say identity issues, the insider-outsider distinction, inclusive or exclusive distinction is at the core. I find it very interesting, from the German experience, that it seems to be the case that Identity is something that just doesn't come to you like that, and you have identity. People make choices. And people make choices. Do you want to live in an open society? Do you feel like you should support refugees? People make the choice to do that, and they will kind of go along and do it, right? It's a complicated task, and anyone who's worked in refugee projects or projects of integration, as we call it, knows, it's a long way, but people make the choice and they do it. But other people make the choice, I don't want any foreigners in my neighborhood. What I find very disturbing is that oftentimes these are communities with very few foreigners. In the case of East Germany, the highest percentage of voters for the right-wing populist AfD, the Alliance for Germany, are in regions where you actually have very few people with a migration background. Whereas cities where you have larger migrant groups, Berlin, Frankfurt, you name it, Munich, they are learning to live and have learned to live with migrants. Again, there are a lot of questions that need to be addressed in terms of education and schools and the labor market. But with the identity issue, I think that we need to look more into how identities are constructed through education, media, right? And social media. People live in bubbles and they only speak to like-minded people nowadays through social media, which kind of exacerbates the problem. So like I said, right-wing authoritarian populist parties have gained votes and seats in many countries, very diverse countries, Austria, Sweden, Germany, Italy, in recent elections. So again, they are not going away. They are going to stay and even become stronger. And what is so disturbing, again, is the radicalization, that a lot of these parties move further to the right than they originally positioned themselves. Now, one of the questions I raised earlier, systemic challenge. Are these parties, or can right-wing populist parties endanger democracy as such? And the examples that we read a lot about are Hungary and Poland. There are colleagues who say Poland and Hungary are no longer democracies. They are illiberal democracies, kind of another category here. But overall, I would say they remain to be not majority parties, but smaller parties. We have proportional representation, so multi-party systems, and they are one party among many others. So to take over government and to change a society into a fascist or authoritarian, that is not that easy. But the systemic, the structural challenge, that is a real kind of issue, I would say. We see that even small parties can influence big decisions. An example is the United Kingdom Independence Party, started as a fringe party, put so much pressure on the Conservatives that they called the referendum about membership in the EU. We've talked a lot about this here. And they, upset the whole political landscape in Britain so that the referendum came out in a way that almost nobody expected. Now UKIP, by the way, is declining, right? Reached the goal or whatever. But the result of this decision, the Brexit decision, is really going far beyond the UK, even though it will hit the UK economically most. It clearly has also consequences for all of Europe. And they can certainly, smaller parties can certainly frame the discourse, change the discourse about borders, about who's in, who is out. The discourse about borders in Europe is now more about security. Let's make it secure. You've seen in the movie, my class, the high fence in Melilla between Morocco and Spain, build these very high fences, and border control becomes the key issue, whereas humanitarian issues become less important. And so the challenge to liberal principles like the basic norm in Europe that we grant asylum to people who are in need, who are persecuted somewhere else. We grant asylum. That's one of the key rights that people have. Many European countries, including Sweden and Germany, the Netherlands and others have taken in a lot of asylum applicants. Not every migrant, of course, is an asylum applicant, but still, these liberal principles are called into question by right-wing groups, even if they are small. And also on the cultural political, that's my last point, the cultural political challenge, the erosion of trust in government, that is indeed a severe problem. The erosion of trust in the free press, the way newspapers and public television reports, the erosion in trust in education, and reasoning and reason per se. That is indeed one of the, I would say, greatest challenges, because you undermine the legitimacy of democracy as such. Democracy needs these public spaces, needs kind of the liberal discourse, and of course needs education. And our societies are complex, and there are no simple answers. So I think that's where the real challenge lies. Thank you very much.